In Search of the Miraculous, Chapter 12. By that time, midsummer 1916, work in our groups began to take new and more intensive forms. G spent most of the time in St. Petersburg, only going to Moscow for a few days and coming back again generally with 2 or 3 of his Moscow pupils. Our lectures and meetings had by that time already lost their formal character. We had all begun to know one another better and, though there was a little friction, we represented on the whole a very compact group, united by interest in the new ideas we were learning and the new possibilities of knowledge and self-knowledge which had been opened out before us. At that time there was about 30 of us. We met almost every evening. Several times, on arriving from Moscow, G arranged excursions into the country for large parties, and picnics where we had shashlik, which were somehow totally out of keeping with St. Petersburg. There remains in my memory a trip to Ostroviki, up the river Neva, more particularly because I suddenly realised on this trip why G arranged these seemingly quite aimless amusements. I realised that he was all the time observing, and that many of us on these occasions showed entirely new aspects of ourselves, which had remained well hidden at the formal meetings in St. Petersburg. My meetings with G's Moscow pupils were at that time quite unlike my first meeting with them in the spring of the preceding year. They did not appear to me now to be either artificial or to be playing a role which had been learned by heart. On the contrary, I always eagerly awaited their coming and tried to find out from them what their work consisted of in Moscow and what G had said to them that we did not know. And I found out from them a great deal which came in very useful to me later in my work. In my new talks with them, I saw the development of a very definite plan. We were not only learning from G, but we had also to learn one from another. I was beginning to see G's groups as a school of some medieval painter, whose pupils lived with him and worked with him and, while learning from him, taught one another. At the same time, I understood why G's Moscow pupils could not answer my questions at our first meeting. I realised how utterly naive my questions had been. On what is based their work on themselves? What constitutes the system which they study? What is the origin of this system? And so on. I understood now that these questions could not be answered. One must learn in order to begin to understand this. And at that time, a little over a year ago, I had thought I had the right to ask such questions, just as the new people who now came to us began with precisely the same kind of questions, and were surprised we did not answer them, and, as we were already able to see, regarded us as artificial or as playing a part which we had learned. But new people appeared only at large meetings at which G took part. Meetings of the original group were at that time held separately, and it was quite clear why this should have been so. We were already beginning to get free from the self-confidence and the knowing of everything with which people approached the work, and we could already understand G better than before. But at general meetings it was extraordinarily interesting for us to hear how new people asked the same questions we used to ask in the beginning, and how they did not understand the same elementary, simple things that we had been unable to understand. These meetings with new people gave us a certain amount of self-satisfaction. But when we were alone again with G, he often with one word destroyed everything that we had built up from ourselves and forced us to see that actually we did not as yet know anything or understand anything, either in ourselves or in others. The whole trouble is that you are quite sure that you are always one and the same, he said, but I see you quite differently. For instance, I see that today one Ouspensky has come here, whereas yesterday there was another. Or the doctor, before you came we were sitting and talking here together, he was one person. Then you all came. I happen to glance at him, and I see quite another doctor sitting there. And the one I see when I am alone with him, you very seldom see. You must realise that each man has a definite repertoire of roles which he plays in ordinary circumstances, said G in this connection. He has a role for every kind of circumstance in which he ordinarily finds himself in life, but put him into even only slightly different circumstances, and he is unable to find a suitable role, and for a short time he becomes himself. The study of the roles a man plays represents a very necessary part of self-knowledge. Each man's repertoire is very limited, and if a man simply says I and Avon Avanich, he will not see the whole of himself, because Avon Avanich also is not one. A man has at least 5 or 6 of them. 1 or 2 for his family, 1 or 2 at his office, 1 for his subordinates and another for his superiors, 1 for friends in a restaurant, and perhaps 1 who is interested in exalted ideas and likes intellectual conversation. And at different times the man is fully identified with one of them and is unable to separate himself from it. To see the roles, to know one's repertoire, particularly to know its limitedness, is to know a great deal. But the point is that outside his repertoire, a man feels very uncomfortable should something push him, if only temporarily, out of his rut, and he tries his hardest to return to any one of his usual roles. Directly he falls back into the rut, everything at once goes smoothly again, and the feeling of awkwardness and tension disappears. This is how it is in life, but in the work, in order to observe oneself, one must become reconciled to this awkwardness and tension, and to the feeling of discomfort and helplessness. Only by experiencing this discomfort can a man really observe himself, and it is clear why this is so. When a man is not playing any of his usual roles, when he cannot find a suitable role in his repertoire, he feels that he is undressed. He is cold and ashamed and wants to run away from everybody. But the question arises, what does he want? A quiet life or to work on himself? If he wants a quiet life, he must certainly first of all never move out of his repertoire. In his usual roles he feels comfortable and at peace. But if he wants to work on himself, he must destroy his peace. To have them both together is no way possible. A man must make a choice. But when choosing, the result is very often deceit. That is to say, a man tries to deceive himself. In words he chooses work, but in reality he does not want to lose his peace. The result is that he sits between 2 stools. This is the most uncomfortable position of all. He does no work at all, and he gets no comfort whatever. But it is very difficult for a man to decide to throw everything to the devil and begin real work. And why is it difficult? Principally because his life is too easy, and even if he considers it bad, he is already accustomed to it. It is better for it to be bad, yet known. But here there is something new and unknown. He does not even know whether any result can be got from it or not. And besides, the most difficult thing here is that it is necessary to obey someone, to submit to someone. If a man could invent difficulties and sacrifices for himself, he would sometimes go very far. But the point here is that this is not possible. It is necessary to obey another or to follow the direction of general work, the control of which can belong only to one person. Such submission is the most difficult thing that there can be for a man who thinks that he is capable of deciding anything or of doing anything. Of course, when he gets rid of these fantasies and sees what he really is, the difficulty disappears. This, however, can only take place in the course of work. But to begin to work, and particularly to continue to work, is very difficult, and it is difficult because life runs too smoothly. On one occasion, continuing this talk about the work of groups, G said, "Later on you will see that everyone in the work is given his own individual task corresponding to his type, and his chief feature or his chief fault, that is, something that will give him an opportunity of struggling more intensively against his chief fault. But besides individual tasks, there are general tasks which are given to the group as a whole, in which case the whole group is responsible for their execution or their non-execution, although in some cases the group is also responsible for individual tasks. But first we will take general tasks. For instance, you ought by now to have some understanding as to the nature of the system and its principal methods, and you ought to be able to pass these ideas on to others. You will remember that at the beginning I was against your talking about the ideas of the system outside the groups. On the contrary, there was a definite rule that none of you, excepting those whom I specially instructed to do so, should talk to anyone either about the groups or the lectures or the ideas, and I explained then why this was necessary. You would not have been able to give a correct picture, a correct impression. Instead of giving people the possibility of coming to these ideas, you would have repelled them forever. You would have even deprived them of the possibility of coming to them at any later time. But now the situation is difficult. You have already heard enough. And if you really have made efforts to understand what you have heard, then you should be able to pass it on to others. Therefore, I give you all a definite task. Try to lead conversations with your friends and acquaintances up to these subjects. Try to prepare those who show interest and, if they ask you to, bring them to the meetings. But everyone must realise that this is his own task and not expect others to do it for him. The proper performance of this task by each of you will show first that you have already assimilated something, understood something, and second, that you are able to appraise people, to understand with whom it is worthwhile talking, and with whom it is not worthwhile, because the majority of people cannot take in any of these ideas, and it is perfectly useless to talk to them. But at the same time, there are people who are able to take in these ideas, and with whom it is worthwhile talking. The next meeting after this was very interesting. Everyone was full of impressions of talks with friends. Everyone had a great many questions. Everyone was somewhat discouraged and disappointed. It proved that friends and acquaintances asked very shrewd questions to which most of our people had no answers. They asked, for instance, what we had got from the work, and openly expressed doubts as to our remembering ourselves. On the other hand, others had themselves no doubt whatever that they remembered themselves. Others found the ray of creation and the 7 cosmoses ridiculous and useless. What has geography to do with this? Very wittily asked one of my friends, parodying a sentence from an amusing play which had been running shortly before this. Others asked who had seen the centres, and how they could be seen. Others found absurd the idea that we could not do. Others found the idea of esotericism entertaining but not convincing. Others said this idea in general was a new invention. Others were not prepared to sacrifice their descent from apes. Others found that there was no idea of the love of mankind in the system. Others said that our ideas were thoroughgoing materialism, that we wanted to make people machines, that there was no idea of the miraculous, no idealism, and so on and so on. G laughed when we recounted to him our conversations with our friends. "This is nothing," he said. "If you were to put together everything that people are able to say about this system, you would not believe in it yourselves. This system has a wonderful property. Even a mere contact with it calls forth either the best or the worst in people. You may know a man all your life and think that he is not a bad fellow, that he is even rather intelligent. Try speaking to him about these ideas, and you will see at once that he is an utter fool. Another man, on the other hand, might appear to have nothing in him, but speak to him on these subjects and you find that he thinks, and thinks very seriously." "How can we recognise people who are able to come to the work?" asked one of those present. "How to recognise them is another question," said G. "To do this it is necessary to a certain extent to be. But before speaking of this we must establish what kind of people are able to come to the work and what kind are not able. You must understand that a man should have, first, a certain preparation, certain luggage. He should know what it is possible to know through ordinary channels about the ideas of esotericism, about hidden knowledge, about possibilities of the inner evolution of man, and so on. What I mean is that these ideas ought not to appear to him as something entirely new. Otherwise it is difficult to speak to him. It is useful also if he has at least some scientific or philosophical preparation. If a man has a good knowledge of religion, this can also be useful. But if he is tied to religious forms and has no understanding of their essence, he will find it very difficult. In general, if a man knows but little, has read but little, has thought but little, it is difficult to talk to him. If he has a good essence, there is another way for him without any talks at all. But in this case he has to be obedient. He has to give up his will. and he has to come to this also in some way or other. It can be said that there is one general rule for everybody. In order to approach this system seriously, people must be disappointed, first of all in themselves, that is to say, in their powers, and secondly, in all the old ways. A man cannot feel what is most valuable in the system unless he is disappointed in what he has been doing, disappointed in what he has been searching for. If he is a scientist, he should be disappointed in his science. If he is a religious man, he should be disappointed in his religion. If he is a politician, he should be disappointed in politics. If he is a philosopher, he should be disappointed in philosophy. If he is a theosophist, he should be disappointed in theosophy. If he is an occultist, he should be disappointed in occultism, and so on. But you must understand what this means. I say, for instance, that a religious man should be disappointed in religion. This does not mean that he should lose his faith. On the contrary, it means being disappointed in the teaching and the methods only, realizing that the religious teaching he knows is not enough for him, can lead him nowhere. All religious teachings, exception of course the completely degenerated religions of savages and the invented religions and sects of modern times, consist of two parts, the visible and the hidden. To be disappointed in religion means being disappointed in the visible, and to feel the necessity for finding the hidden and unknown part of religion. To be disappointed in science does not mean losing interest in knowledge. It means being convinced that the usual scientific methods are not only useless, but lead to the construction of absurd and self-contradictory theories, and having become convinced of this, to begin to search for others. To be disappointed in philosophy means being convinced that ordinary philosophy is merely, as it is said in the Russian proverb, pouring from one empty vessel into another, and that people do not even know what philosophy means, although true philosophy also can and should exist. To be disappointed in occultism does not mean losing faith in the miraculous. It is merely being convinced that ordinary, accessible, and even advertised occultism, under whatever name it may pass, is simply charlatanism and self-deception, and that, although somewhere something does exist, everything that man knows or is able to learn in the ordinary way is not what he needs. So that, no matter what he used to do before, no matter what used to interest him, if a man has arrived at this state of disappointment in ways that are possible and accessible, it is worthwhile speaking to him about our system, and then he may come to the work. But if he continues to think that he is able to find anything on his former way, or that he has not as yet tried all the ways, or that he can, by himself, find anything or do anything, it means that he is not ready. I do not mean that he must throw up everything he used to do before. This is entirely unnecessary. On the contrary, it is often even better if he continues to do what he used to do. But he must realise that it is only a profession or a habit or a necessity. In this case, it is another matter. He will then be able not to identify. There is only one thing incompatible with work, and that is professional occultism. In other words, professional charlatanism. All these spiritualists, healers, clairvoyants, and so on, or even people closely connected with them, are none of them any good to us. And you must always remember this and take care not to tell them much, because everything they learn from you they might use for their own purposes, that is, to make fools of other people. There are still other categories which are no good, but we will speak of them later. In the meantime, remember one thing only. A man must be sufficiently disappointed in ordinary ways, and he must at the same time think or be able to accept the idea that there may be something, somewhere. If you should speak to such a man, he might discern the flavour of truth in what you say, no matter how clumsily you might speak. But if you should speak to a man who is convinced about something else, everything you say will sound absurd to him, and he will never even listen to you seriously. It is not worthwhile wasting time on him. This system is for those who have already sought and have burned themselves. Those who have not sought and who are not seeking do not need it, and those who have not yet burned themselves do not need it either. But this is not what people begin with, said one of our company. They ask, do we admit the existence of the ether? Or how do we look on evolution? Or why do we not believe in progress? Or why do we not think that people can and should organise life on the basis of justice and the common good? And things of this sort. All questions are good, said G, and you can begin from any questions if only it is sincere. You understand that what I mean is that this very question about ether, or about progress, or about the common good, could be asked by a man simply in order to say something, or to repeat what someone else has said, or what he has read in some book. And on the other hand, he could ask it because this is the question with which he aches. If it is an aching question for him, you can give him an answer, and you can bring him to the system through any question whatever. But it is necessary for the question to be an aching one. Our talks about people who could be interested in the system and able to work involuntarily led us towards a valuation of our friends from an entirely new point of view. In this respect, we all experienced bitter disappointment. Even before G had formally requested us to speak of the system to our friends, we had, of course, all tried, in one way or another, to talk about it at any rate with those of whom we met most often. And in most cases our enthusiasm in regard to the ideas of the system met with a very cold reception. They did not understand us. The ideas which seemed to us new and original seemed to our friends to be old and tedious, leading nowhere, and even repellent. This astonished us more than anything else. We were amazed that people with whom we had felt an inner intimacy, with whom in former times we had been able to talk about all questions that worried us, and in whom we had found a response, could fail to see what we saw, and above all that they could see something quite opposite. I have to say that, in regard to my own personal experience, it gave me a very strange, even painful impression. I speak of the absolute impossibility of making people understand us. We are, of course, accustomed to this in ordinary life, in the realm of ordinary questions, and we know that people who are hostile to us at heart, or narrow-minded, or incapable of thought, can misunderstand us, twist and distort anything we say, can ascribe to us thoughts we never had, words which we never uttered, and so on. But now, when we saw that all this was being done by those whom we used to regard as our kind of people, with whom we used to spend very much of our time, and who formerly had seemed to understand us better than anyone else, it produced on us a discouraging impression. Such cases, of course, constituted the exceptions. Most of our friends were merely indifferent, and all our attempts to infect them with our interest in G's system led to nothing. But sometimes they got a very curious impression of us. I do not remember now who was the first to notice that our friends found we had begun to change for the worse. They found us less interesting than we had been before. They told us we were becoming colourless, as though we were fading, were losing our former spontaneity, our former responsiveness to everything, that we were becoming machines, were ceasing to think originally, were ceasing to feel, that we were merely repeating like parrots what we heard from G. G laughed a great deal when we told him about this. "Wait, there is worse to come," he said. "Do you understand what this really means? It means that you have stopped lying. At any rate, you don't lie so well. That is, you can no longer lie in so interesting a way as before. He is an interesting man who lies well, but you are already ashamed of lying. You are now able to acknowledge to yourselves sometimes that there is something you do not know or do not understand, and you cannot talk as if you knew all about everything. It means, of course, that you have become less interesting, less original, and less, as they say, responsive. So now you are really able to see what sort of people your friends are, and on their part they are sorry for you, and in their own way they are right. You have already begun to die." He emphasised this word. "It is a long way yet to complete death, but still a certain amount of silliness is going out of you. You can no longer deceive yourselves as sincerely as you did before. You have now got the taste of truth." "Why does it seem to me sometimes now that I understand absolutely nothing?" said one of those present. "Formerly I used to think that sometimes, at any rate, There were some things I understood, but now I do not understand anything. It means you have begun to understand, said G. When you understood nothing, you thought you understood everything, or at any rate that you were able to understand everything. Now, when you have begun to understand, you think you do not understand. This comes about because the taste of understanding was quite unknown to you before, and now the taste of understanding seems to you to be a lacking of understanding. In our talks, we often return to the impressions our friends had of us, and to our new impressions of our friends, and we began to realise that, more than anything else, these ideas could either unite people or separate them. There was once a very long and interesting talk about types. G repeated everything he had said before about this, together with many additions and indications for personal work. Each of you, he said, has probably met in life people of one and the same type. Such people often even look like one another, and their inner reactions to things are exactly the same. What one likes the other will like, what one does not like the other will not like. You must remember such occasions because you can study the science of types only by meeting types. There is no other method. Everything else is imagination. You must understand that in the conditions in which you live you cannot meet with more than 6 or 7 types, although there are in life a greater number of fundamental types. The rest are all combinations of these fundamental types. How many fundamental types are there in all? Asked someone. Some people say 12, said G. According to the legend, the 12 apostles represented the 12 types. Others say more. He paused. Maybe you know these 12 types, that is, their definitions and characteristics, asked one of those present. I was expecting this question, said G. There has never been an occasion when I have spoken of types when some clever person has not asked this question. How is it you do not understand that if it could be explained, it would have been explained long ago? But the whole thing is that types and their differences cannot be defined in ordinary language, and the language in which they could be defined you do not as yet know and will not know for a long time. It is exactly the same as with the 48 laws. Someone invariably asks whether he may not know these 48 laws, as if it were possible. Understand that you are being given everything that can be given. With the help of what is given to you, you must find the rest. But I know that I am wasting time now in saying this. You still do not understand me, and will not understand me for a long time yet. Think of the difference between knowledge and being. There are things for the understanding of which a different being is necessary. But if there are no more than 7 types around us, why can we not know them? That is, what is the chief difference between them, and when meeting them be able to recognise and distinguish them, said one of us. You must begin with yourself and with the observations of which I have already spoken, said G. Otherwise it would be knowledge of which you would be able to make no use. Some of you think you can see types, but they are not types at all that you see. In order to see types, one must know one's own type and be able to depart from it. In order to know one's own type, one must make a good study of one's life, one's whole life from the very beginning. One must know why and how things have happened. I want to give you all a task. It will be a general and an individual task at one and the same time. Let every one of you in the group tell us about his life. Everything must be told in detail without embellishment and without suppressing anything. Emphasise the principal and essential things without dwelling on trifles and details. You must be sincere and not be afraid that others will take anything in a wrong way, because everyone is in the same position. Everyone must strip himself. Everyone must show himself as he is. This task will once more show you why nothing must be taken outside the groups. Nobody would dare to speak if he thought or suspected that what he said in the group would be repeated outside. But he ought to be fully and firmly convinced that nothing will be repeated, and then he will be able to speak without fear, with the understanding that others must do the same. Soon afterwards G went to Moscow, and in his absence we tried in various ways to carry out the tasks allotted to us. First of all, in order to put G's task more easily into practice. Some of us, at my suggestion, tried telling the story of our lives not at the general group meeting, but in small groups composed of people they knew best. I am bound to say that all these attempts came to nothing. Some said too much, others said too little. Some went into unnecessary details or into descriptions of what they considered were their particular and original characteristics. Others concentrated on their sins and errors, but everything taken together failed to produce what G evidently expected. The result was anecdotes, or chronological memoirs which interested nobody, and family recollections which made people yawn. Something was wrong, but what exactly was wrong even those who had tried to be as sincere as they could were unable to determine. I remember my own attempts. In the first place, I tried to convey certain early childhood impressions, which seemed to me psychologically interesting because I remembered myself as I was at a very early age and was always myself astonished by some of these early impressions. But nobody was interested in this, and I quickly saw that this was certainly not what was required of us. I proceeded further, but almost immediately I felt a certainty that there were many things that I had no intention whatever of telling. This was a quite unexpected realisation. I had accepted G's ideas without any opposition, and I thought I would be able to tell the story of my life without any particular difficulty. But in reality, it turned out to be quite impossible. Something in me registered such a vehement protest against it that I did not even attempt to struggle, and in speaking of certain periods of my life, I tried to give only the general idea and the significance of the facts which I did not want to relate. In this connection I noted that my voice and intonations changed when I talked in this way. This helped me to understand other people. I began to hear that, in speaking of themselves and their lives, they also spoke in different voices and different intonations. And there were intonations of a particular kind which I had first heard in myself and which showed me that people wanted to hide something in what they were talking about. But intonations gave them away. Observation of intonations afterwards made it possible for me to understand many other things. When G next came to St. Petersburg, he had been in Moscow this time for 2 or 3 weeks, we told him of our attempts. He listened to everything and merely said that we did not know how to separate personality from essence. Personality hides behind essence, he said, and essence hides behind personality, and they mutually screen each other. How can essence be separated from personality? Asked one of those present. How would you separate your own from what is not your own? G replied. It is necessary to think. It is necessary to know where one or another of your characteristics has come from. And it is necessary to realise that most people, especially in your circle of society, have very little of their own. Everything they have is not their own and is mostly stolen. Everything that they call ideas, convictions, views, conceptions of the world has all been pilfered from various sources. And all of it together makes up personality and must be cast aside. But you yourself said that work begins with personality, said someone there. Quite true, replied G. Therefore, we must first of all establish of what precisely we are speaking, of what moment in a man's development and of what level of being. Just now I was simply speaking of a man in life who had no connection whatever with the work. Such a man, particularly if he belongs to the intellectual classes, is almost entirely composed of personality. In most cases his essence ceases to develop at a very early age. I know respected fathers of families, professors full of various ideas, well-known authors, important officials who were almost ministers, whose essence had stopped developing approximately at the age of 12. And that is not so bad. It sometimes happens that certain aspects of essence stop at 5 or 6 years of age, and then everything ends. All the rest is not their own. It is repertoire, or taken from books, or it has been created by imitating ready-made models. After this there were many conversations in which G took part, during which we tried to find out the reason for our failure to fulfill the tasks set by G. But the more we talked, the less we understood what he actually wanted from us. This only shows to what extent you do not know yourselves, said G. I do not doubt that at least some of you sincerely wish to do what I said, that is, to relate the story of their lives. At the same time, they see that they cannot do it, and do not even know how to begin. But remember that sooner or later you will have to go through this. This is, as it is called, one of the first tests on the way. Without going through this, no one can go further. What is it we do not understand? Asked someone. You do not understand what it means to be sincere, said G. You are so used to lying both to yourselves and to others that you can find neither words nor thoughts when you wish to speak the truth. To tell the complete truth about oneself is very difficult, but before telling it one must know it, and you do not even know what the truth about yourselves consists of. Some day I will tell every one of you his chief feature or chief fault. We shall then see whether you will understand me or not. One very interesting conversation took place at this time. I felt very strongly everything that took place at that time. Especially strongly did I feel that in spite of every effort, I was unable to remember myself for any length of time. At first something seemed to be successful, but later it all went, and I felt without any doubt the deep sleep in which I was immersed. Failures in attempts to relate the story of my life, and especially the fact that I even failed to understand clearly what G wanted, still further increased my bad mood, which, however, as always with me, expressed itself not in depression, but in irritation. In this state I came once to lunch with G in a restaurant on the Sadoyava, opposite the Kostanoy Dvor. I was probably very curt, or on the contrary very silent. "What is the matter with you today?" asked G. "I myself do not know," said I, "only I am beginning to feel that with us nothing is being achieved, or rather that I am achieving nothing. I cannot speak about others, but I cease to understand you, and you no longer explain anything as you used to explain it in the beginning. And I feel that in this way nothing will be achieved." "Wait a little," said G. "Soon conversations will start. Try to understand me. Up to now we've been trying to find each thing's place. Soon we shall begin to call things by their proper names." G's words remained in my memory, but I did not go into them and continued my own thoughts. "What does it matter," I said, "how we shall call things when I can connect nothing together? You never answer any questions I ask." "Very well," said G, laughing. "I promise to answer now any question you care to ask, as it happens in fairy tales." I felt that he wanted to draw me out of my bad mood, and I was inwardly grateful to him, although something in me refused to be mollified. And suddenly I remembered that I wanted above all to know what G thought about eternal recurrence, about the repetition of lives as I understood it. I had many times tried to start a conversation about this and to tell G my views. But these conversations had always remained almost monologues. G had listened in silence and then began to talk of something else. "Very well," I said. "Tell me what you think of recurrence. Is there any truth in this, or none at all? What I mean is, do we live only this once and then disappear? Or does everything repeat and repeat itself, perhaps an endless number of times, only we do not know and do not remember it?" "This idea of repetition," said G, "is not the full and absolute truth, but it is the nearest possible approximation of the truth. In this case, truth cannot be expressed in words, but what you say is very near to it. And if you understand why I do not speak of this, you will be still nearer to it. What is the use of a man knowing about recurrence if he is not conscious of it, and if he himself does not change? One can say, even, if a man does not change, repetition does not exist for him. If you tell him about repetition, it will only increase his sleep. Why should he make any efforts today when there is so much time and so many possibilities ahead, the whole of eternity? Why should he bother today? This is exactly why the system does not say anything about repetition and takes only this one life which we know. The system has neither meaning nor sense without striving for self-change. and work on self-change must begin today, immediately. All laws can be seen in one life. Knowledge about the repetition of lives will add nothing for a man if he does not see how everything repeats itself in one life, that is, in this life, and if he does not strive to change himself in order to escape this repetition. But if he changes something essential in himself, that is, if he attains something, this cannot be lost. Is the conclusion right that all the tendencies that are created or formed must grow? I asked. Yes and no, said G. This is true in most cases, just as it is true in one life. But on a big scale, new forces may enter. I shall not explain this now, but think about what I am going to say. Planetary influences also can change. They are not permanent. Besides this, tendencies themselves can be different. There are tendencies which, once they have appeared, continue and develop by themselves mechanically, and there are others which need constant pushing and which immediately weaken and may vanish altogether or turn into dreaming if a man ceases to work on them. Moreover, there is a definite time, a definite term for everything. Possibilities for everything, he emphasised these words, exist only for a definite time. I was extremely interested in everything G said. Much of this I had guessed before, but the fact that he recognised my fundamental premises, and all that he brought into them, had for me a tremendous importance. Everything began immediately to become connected. I felt that I saw the outline of the majestic building which was spoken of in the glimpses of truth. My bad mood vanished. I did not even notice when. G sat there smiling. You see how easy it is to turn you, but perhaps I was merely romancing to you. Perhaps there is no recurrence at all. What pleasure is it when a sulky Ouspensky sits there, does not eat, does not drink? Let us try to cheer him up, I think to myself. And how is one to cheer a person up? One likes funny stories. For another, you must find his hobby. And I know that Ouspensky has his hobby, eternal recurrence. So I offered to answer any question of his. I knew what he would ask. But G's chaff did not affect me. He had given me something very substantial and could not take it back. I did not believe his jokes and did not believe that he could have invented what he had said about recurrence. I also learned to understand his intonations. The future showed that I was right, for although G did not introduce the idea of recurrence into his exposition of the system, he referred several times to the idea of recurrence, chiefly in speaking of the lost possibilities of people who had approached the system and then had drawn away from it. Conversations in groups continued as usual. Once G said that he wanted to carry out an experiment on the separation of personality from essence. We were all very interested because he had promised experiments for a long time, but till then we had seen nothing. I will not describe his methods. I will merely describe the people whom he chose that first evening for the experiment. One was no longer young and was a man who occupied a fairly prominent position in society. At our meeting, he spoke much and often about himself, his family, about Christianity, and about the events of the moment connected with the war, and with all possible kinds of scandal that had very much disgusted him. The other was younger. Many of us did not consider him to be a serious person. Very often he played what is called the fool, or, on the other hand, entered into endless formal arguments about some or other details of the system, without any relation whatever to the whole. It was very difficult to understand him. He spoke in a confused and intricate manner, even of the most simple things, mixing up in a most impossible way different points of view and words belonging to different categories and levels. I pass over the beginning of the experiment. We were sitting in the big drawing room. The conversation went on as usual. Now observe, G whispered to us. The older of the two who was speaking heatedly about something suddenly became silent in the middle of a sentence and seemed to sink into his chair, looking straight in front of him. At a sign from G, we continued to talk without looking at him. The younger one began to listen to the talk and then spoke himself. All of us looked at one another. His voice had become different. He told us some observations about himself in a clear, simple and intelligible manner, without superfluous words, without extravagances, and without buffoonery. Then he became silent. He smoked a cigarette and was obviously thinking of something. The first one sat still without moving, as though shrunken into a ball. "Ask him what he is thinking about," said G quietly. "I?" He lifted his head as though waking up when he was questioned. "About nothing." He smiled weakly, as though apologising, or as though he was surprised at anyone asking him what he was thinking about. "Well, you were talking about the war just now," said one of us, "about what would happen if we made peace with the Germans. Do you still think as you did then?" "I don't know really," he said in an uncertain voice. "Did I say that?" "Yes, certainly. You just said that everyone was obliged to think about it, that no one had the right not to think about it, and that no one had the right to forget the war. Everyone ought to have a definite opinion, yes or no, for or against the war." He listened as though he did not grasp what the questioner was saying. "Yes," he said. "How odd, I do not remember anything about it." "But aren't you interested in it?" "No, it does not interest me at all." "Are you not thinking of the consequences of all that is now taking place, of the results for Russia, for the whole of civilization?" He shook his head as though with regret. "I do not understand what you are talking about," he says. "It does not interest me at all, and I know nothing about it." "Well then, you spoke before of your family. Would it not be very much easier for you if they became interested in our ideas and joined the work?" "Yes, perhaps," again in an uncertain voice. "But why should I think about it?" "Well, you said you were afraid of the gulf, as you expressed it, which was growing between you and them." No reply. "But what do you think about it now?" "I am not thinking about it at all." "If you were asked what you would like, what would you say?" Again a wandering glance. "I do not want anything." "But think, what would you like?" On the small table beside him there stood an unfinished glass of tea. He gazed at it for a long time as though considering something. He glanced around him twice, then again looked at the glass and said in such a serious voice and with such serious intonations that we all looked at one another, "I think I should like some raspberry jam." "Why are you questioning him?" said a voice from the corner which we hardly recognised. This was the second experiment. "Can you not see that he is asleep?" "And you yourself?" asked one of us. "I, on the contrary, have woken up." "Why has he gone to sleep while you have woken up?" "I do not know." With this the experiment ended. Neither of them remembered anything the next day. G explained to us that with the first man, everything that constituted the subject of his ordinary conversation, of his alarms and agitation, was in personality, and when his personality was asleep, practically nothing remained. In the personality of the other there was also a great deal of undue talkativeness, but behind the personality there was an essence which knew as much as the personality and knew it better, and when personality went to sleep, essence took its place to which it had a much greater right. "Note that contrary to his custom he spoke very little," said G, "but he was observing all of you and everything that was taking place, and nothing escaped him." "But of what use is it to him if he also does not remember?" said one of us. "Essence remembers," said G, "personality is forgotten, and this was necessary because otherwise personality would have perverted everything and would have ascribed all this to itself." "But this is a kind of black magic," said one of us. "Worse," said G. "Wait, and you will see worse than that." When speaking of types, G once said, "Have you noticed what a tremendous part type plays in the relationship between man and woman?" "I have noticed," I said, "that throughout his whole life every man comes into contact with women of a definite type, and every woman comes into contact with men of a definite type, as though the type of woman for every man has been predetermined, and the type of man predetermined for every woman." "There is a good deal of truth in that," said G, "but in that form it is of course much too general. Actually, you did not see types of men and women, but types of events. What I speak of refers to the real type, that is to say, to essence. If people were to live in essence, one type would always find the other type, and wrong types would never come together. But people live in personality. Personality has its own interests and its own tastes, which have nothing in common with the interests and the tastes of essence. Personality in our case is the result of the wrong work of centres. For this reason, personality can dislike precisely what essence likes, and like what essence does not like. Here is where the struggle between essence and personality begins. Essence knows what it wants, but cannot explain it. Personality does not want to hear of it, and takes no account of it. It has its own desires, and it acts in its own way. But its power does not continue beyond that moment. After that, in some way or other, the two essences have to live together, and they hate one another. No sort of acting can help here. In one way or another, essence or type gains the upper hand and decides. In this case, nothing can be done by reason or by calculation. Neither can so-called love help because, in the real meaning of the word, mechanical man cannot love. With him, it loves or it does not love. At the same time, sex plays a tremendous role in maintaining the mechanicalness of life. Everything that people do is connected with sex. Politics, religion, art, theatre, music is all sex. Do you think people go to the theatre or to church to pray or to see some new play? That is only for the sake of appearances. The principal thing in the theatre, as well as in church, is that there will be a lot of women or a lot of men. This is the centre of gravity of all gatherings. What do you think brings people to cafes, to restaurants, to various fetes? One thing only: sex. It is the principal motive force of all mechanicalness. All sleep, all hypnosis depends upon it. You must try to understand what I mean. Mechanicalness is especially dangerous when people try to explain it by something else and not by what it really is. When sex is clearly conscious of itself and does not cover itself up by anything else, it is not the mechanicalness about which I am speaking. On the contrary, sex which exists by itself and is not dependent on anything else is already a great achievement. But the evil lies in this constant self-deception. What then is the deduction? Should it be so or should it be changed? Asked someone. G smiled. That is something people always ask, he said. Whatever they may be speaking about, they ask, ought it to be like that, and how can it be changed? That is, what ought to be done in such a case? As though it were possible to change anything, as though it were possible to do anything. You at least ought to have realised by now how naive such questions are. Cosmic forces have created this state of affairs, and cosmic forces control this state of affairs. And you ask, can it be left like that, or should it be changed? God himself can change nothing. Do you remember what was said about the 48 laws? They cannot be changed. But liberation from a considerable portion of them is possible. That is to say, there is a possibility of changing the state of affairs for oneself. It is possible to escape from the general law. You should understand that in this case, as well as in all others, the general law cannot be changed. But one can change one's own position in relation to this law. One can escape from the general law. The more so since in this law about which I speak, that is, in the power of sex over people, are included many different possibilities. It includes the chief form of slavery, and it is also the chief possibility of liberation. This is what you must understand. New birth, of which we have spoken before, depends as much upon sex energy as do physical birth and the propagation of species. Hydrogen C12 is the hydrogen which represents the final product of the transformation of food in the human organism. This is the matter with which sex works and which sex manufactures. It is seed or fruit. Hydrogen C12 can pass into dough of the next octave with the help of an additional shock. But this shock can be of a dual nature and different octave can begin. One outside the organism, which has produced C, and the other in the organism itself. The union of male and female C12 and all that accompanies it constitutes the shock of the first kind, and the new octave began with its help develops independently as a new organism or a new life. This is the normal and natural way to use the energy of C12. But in the same organism there is a further possibility, and this is the possibility of creating a new life within the actual organism in which the C12 has been manufactured, without the union of the two principles, the male and the female. A new octave then develops within the organism, not outside it. This is the birth of the astral body. You must understand that the astral body is born of the same material, of the same matter, as the physical body, only the process is different. The whole of the physical body, all its cells are, so to speak, permeated by emanations of the matter C12. And when they have become sufficiently saturated, the matter C12 begins to crystallize. The crystallization of this matter constitutes the formation of the astral body. The transition of matter C12 into emanations and the gradual saturation of the whole organism by it is what alchemy calls transmutation or transformation. It is just this transformation of the physical body into the astral that alchemy called the transformation of the coarse into the fine, or the transformation of base metals into gold. Completed transmutation, that is to say, the formation of the astral body, is possible only in a healthy, normally functioning organism. In a sick or a perverted or a crippled organism, no transmutation is possible. Is complete sexual abstinence necessary for transmutation, and is sexual abstinence in general useful for work on oneself? We asked him. Here there is not one but a number of questions, said G. In the first place, sexual abstinence is necessary for transmutation only in certain cases, that is, for certain types of people. For others it is not at all necessary, and with yet others it comes by itself when transmutation begins. I will explain this more clearly. For certain types, a long and complete sexual abstination is necessary for transmutation to begin. This means, in other words, that without a long and complete sexual abstinence, transmutation will not begin. But once it has begun, abstinence is no longer necessary. In other cases, that is with other types, transmutation can begin in a normal sexual life, and, on the contrary, can begin sooner and proceed better with a very great outward expenditure of sex energy. In the third case, the beginning of transmutation does not require abstinence. But, having begun, transmutation takes the whole of sexual energy and puts an end to normal sexual life or the outward expenditure of sex energy. Then the other question, is sexual abstinence useful for the work or not? It is useful if there is abstinence in all centres. If there is abstinence in one centre and full liberty of imagination in the others, then there could be nothing worse. And still more, abstinence can be useful if a man knows what to do with the energy which he saves in this way. If he does not know what to do with it, nothing whatever can be gained by abstinence. Speaking in general, what is the most correct form of life in this connection from the point of view of the work? It is impossible to say. I repeat that while a man does not know, it is better for him not to attempt anything. Until he has new and exact knowledge, it will be quite enough if his life is guided by the usual rules and principles. If a man begins to theorise and invent in this sphere, it will lead to nothing except psychopathy. But it must again be remembered that only a person who is completely normal as regards sex has any chance in the work. Any kind of originality, strange tastes, strange desires, or on the other hand, fears, constantly working buffers, must be destroyed from the very beginning. Modern education and modern life create an enormous number of sexual psychopaths. They have no chance at all in the work. Speaking in general, there are only two correct ways of expending sexual energy: normal sexual life and transmutation. All inventions in this sphere are very dangerous. People have tried abstinence from times beyond memory. Sometimes, very rarely, it has led to something, but in most cases what is called abstinence is simply exchanging normal sensations for abnormal, because the abnormal are more easily hidden. But it is not about this that I wish to speak. You must understand where lies the chief evil and what makes for slavery. It is not in sex itself, but in the abuse of sex. But what the abuse of sex means is again misunderstood. People usually take this to be either excess or perversion. But there are comparatively innocent forms of abuse of sex, and it is necessary to know the human machine very well in order to grasp what abuse of sex in the real meaning of these words is. It means the wrong work of centres in relation to sex. That is, the action of the sex centre through other centres, and the action of other centres through the sex centre, or, to be still more precise, the functioning of the sex centre with energy borrowed from other centres, and the functioning of other centres with energy borrowed from the sex centre. Can sex be regarded as an independent centre? Asked one of those present. It can, said G. At the same time, if all the lower story is taken as one whole, then sex can be regarded as the neutralising part of the moving centre. With what hydrogen does the sex centre work? Asked another. This question had interested us for a long time, but we had not previously been able to answer it. And G, when he had been asked before, had never given a direct reply. The sex centre works with hydrogen 12, he said on this occasion. That is to say, it ought to work with it. This is C12. But the fact is that it very rarely works with its proper hydrogen. Abnormalities in the working of the sex centre require special study. In the first place, it must be noted that normally in the sex centre, as well as in the higher emotional and the higher thinking centres, there is no negative side. In all the other centres except the higher ones, in the thinking, in the emotional, in the moving, in the instinctive, in all of them, there are, so to speak, two halves, the positive and the negative, affirmation and negation, or yes or no, in the thinking centre, pleasant and unpleasant sensations in the moving and instinctive centres. There is no such division in the sex centre. There are no positive and negative sides in it. There are no unpleasant sensations or unpleasant feelings in it. There is either a pleasant sensation, a pleasant feeling, or there is nothing, an absence of any sensation, complete indifference. But in consequence of the wrong work of centres, it often happens that the sex centre unites with the negative part of the emotional centre, or with the negative part of the instinctive centre, and then stimulation of a certain kind of the sex centre, or even any stimulation at all of the sex centre, calls forth unpleasant feelings and unpleasant sensations. People who experience unpleasant feelings and sensations which have been invoked in them through ideas and imagination connected with sex are inclined to regard them as a great virtue or as something original. In actual fact, it is simply disease. Everything connected with sex should be either pleasant or indifferent. Unpleasant feelings and sensations all come from the emotional centre or the instinctive centre. This is the abuse of sex. It is necessary, further, to remember that the sex centre works with hydrogen 12. This means that it is stronger and quicker than all other centres. Sex, in fact, governs all other centres. The only thing in ordinary circumstances, that is, when man has neither consciousness nor will, that holds the sex centre in submission, is buffers. Buffers can entirely bring it to naught. That is, they can stop its normal manifestation, but they cannot destroy its energy. The energy remains and passes over to other centres, finding expression for itself through them. In other words, the other centres rob the sex centre of the energy which it does not use itself. The energy of the sex centre in the work of the thinking, emotional, moving centres can be recognised by a particular taste, by a particular fervour, by a feminence which the nature of the affair concerned does not call for. The thinking centre writes books, but in making use of the energy of the sex centre, it does not simply occupy itself with philosophy, science or politics. It is always fighting something, disputing, criticising, creating new subjective theories. The emotional centre preaches Christianity, abstinence, asceticism, or the fear and horror of sin, hell, the torment of sinners, eternal fire, all this with the energy of the sex centre. Or, on the other hand, it works up revolutions, robs, burns, kills, again with the same energy. The moving centre occupies itself with sport, creates various records, climbs mountains, jumps, fences, wrestles, fights, and so on. In all these instances, that is, in the work of the thinking centre as well as in the work of the emotional and the moving centres, when they work with the energy of the sex centre, there is always one general characteristic, and this is a certain particular vehemence and, together with it, the uselessness of the work in question. Neither the thinking nor the emotional nor the moving centres can ever create anything useful with the energy of the sex centre. This is an example of the abuse of sex. But there is only one aspect of it. Another aspect consists in the fact that when the energy of the sex centre is plundered by the other centres and spent on useless work, it has nothing left for itself and has to steal the energy of other centres, which is much lower and coarser than its own. And yet the sex centre is very important for the general activity, and particularly for the inner growth of the organism, because, working with hydrogen-12, it can receive a very fine food of impressions, such as none of the ordinary centres can receive. The fine food of impressions is very important for the manufacture of the higher hydrogens. But when the sex centre works with energy, that is, not its own, that is, with the comparatively low hydrogens 48 and 24, its impressions become much coarser, and it ceases to play the role in the organism which it could play. At the same time, union with and the use of its energy by the thinking centre creates far too great an imagination on the subject of sex, and in addition, a tendency to be satisfied with this imagination. Union with the emotional centre creates sentimentality or, on the contrary, jealousy, cruelty. This is again a picture of the abuse of sex. What must be done to struggle against the abuse of sex? Asked someone present. G laughed. I was just waiting for that question, he said. But you already ought to understand that it is just as impossible to explain to a man who has not yet begun to work on himself and does not know the structure of the machine what the abuse of sex means, as it is to say what must be done to avoid these abuses. Right work on oneself begins with the creation of a permanent centre of gravity. When a permanent centre of gravity has been created, everything else begins to be disposed and distributed in subordination to it. The question comes to this: from what and how can a permanent centre of gravity be created? And to this may be replied that only a man's attitude to the work, to school, his valuation of the work, and his realisation of the mechanicalness and aimlessness of everything else can create in him a permanent centre of gravity. The role of the sex centre in creating a general equilibrium and a permanent centre of gravity can be very big. According to its energy, that is to say, if it uses its own energy, the sex centre stands on a level with the higher emotional centre, and all the other centres are subordinate to it. Therefore, it would be a great thing if it worked with its own energy. This alone would indicate a comparatively very high level of being, and in this case, that is, if the sex centre worked with its own energy and in its own place, all other centres could work correctly in their places and with their own energies.